The Moltke class were the second class of German battlecruisers built and consisted of a pair of ships, the SMS Moltke and the SMS Goeben. The previous class had been a single ship, Von der Tann, and the following class, Seydlitz, would also be a single ship. Compared to the Von der Tann, the class offered a number of incremental improvements. It's important to note that German battlecruisers were designed with an entirely different role to British battlecruisers. The original concept developed by the Royal Navy was for the battle cruiser, or as it was first called the dreadnought armoured cruiser, to be used on operations far from home against enemy armoured and light cruisers. The idea was for a few ships with long range, heavy firepower, and just enough armour to protect the ship from these smaller vessels, which would generally only have guns up to about 8-inch calibre. These battle cruisers would then be able to destroy multiple enemy vessels and secure trade routes, freeing up the more numerous armoured and protected cruisers of the Royal Navy to return home and form the fleet screen for the battle fleet. In contrast, the German battle cruisers were never intended to fulfil this role. Instead, they were designed from the start to be part of the German fleet screen, and in this role their targets were similar, armoured and protected cruisers. But because this role was connected with the battle fleet and they carried significant firepower, they were also expected to encounter and help fight the British battleships, which meant they needed armour that could at least offer some protection from battleship-grade firepower. Therefore, German battlecruisers would tend to carry a slightly lighter armament, but heavier armour than British designs until the end of World War I. As a result, the Moltke class would carry an 11-inch armoured belt, which was comparable to that carried on the smaller battleships of the period, along with an armament of 10 11-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, one forward, a pair superfiring at the rear, and a pair of wing turrets in echelon that in theory gave a 10-gun broadside on limited bearings, but in practice usually offered an 8-gun broadside. Initially, these guns could only elevate to 13.5 degrees, significantly less than their predecessors, which limited their range considerably. This was changed in 1916, but would still leave the German ships outranged by British vessels. 12 single 5.9-inch guns made up the secondary battery, and at first 12 88mm guns were installed to fight off torpedo boats, but these were soon replaced by 4 anti-aircraft variants of the same gun. Finally, 4 torpedo tubes were added, with 1 on each major bearing. The ships were designed for just over 25 knots, but proved capable of just over 28 knots at full power, which would prove very useful in service. Although they were the first German battlecruisers designed and built as a class, they would never serve in war together. Whilst the Moltke was used in various prestigious peacetime roles before the outbreak of the First World War, the Goeben was sent to the Mediterranean almost as soon as she was completed, along with the cruiser Breslau, in an attempt to establish German influence over the Balkan Wars, which had broken out in 1912. They were still there when the First World War started in 1914 and were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the British and French forces present in the area. Trying to break out past Gibraltar and back to Germany would have been suicide, so the ships set off for the Ottoman Empire instead. Here, the ship's unusually high speed proved to be their salvation, as the Goeben was able to just about stay ahead of the British battlecruisers and armoured cruisers long enough to reach safety. Upon arrival, she was transferred to the Ottoman Navy, although she kept her crew, and this was part of the reason for the Ottoman entry into the war on the German side. This subject is also covered in the video on HMS Agincourt. The Goeben went on to have a very active career, surviving to join the NATO fleet after the Second World War, and only being scrapped in 1971. We'll cover her adventures in a bit more detail in her own video. The Moltke was still in Germany, and so took part in operations with the rest of the High Seas Fleet. The ship almost participated in the First Battle of Heligoland Bight, but by the time they had permission to go and rescue the German cruisers and had built up the steam, the tide was too low to clear the port, and they had to wait for the main fighting to be over, serving only to secure the survivors and look for any missing ships. Her next mission was the Bombardment of Yarmouth, along with the other German battle cruisers, which was accomplished without any major action or response. The Bombardment of Scarborough went similarly, although in this case the ship took a single minor hit from a coastal defence gun. The next encounter was the Battle of Dogger Bank, a clash between the British and German battlecruisers. This was inconclusive, with the Germans withdrawing with the loss of the cruiser Blücher and heavy damage to the battlecruiser Seydlitz in exchange for significant damage to the HMS Lion. Moltke herself is not recorded to have taken any damage in this battle, but did score hits on the Lion and Tiger. An interlude into the Gulf of Riga was less successful, with the ship being torpedoed by a British submarine and needing to be sent into dock for repairs. A second bombardment of Yarmouth led to another single hit of little consequence and a brief fight with British light cruisers, cut short by the Grand Fleet heading out to engage the raiders, which resulted in a retreat. Her main claim to fame is, of course, her participation in the Battle of Jutland. In the first part of the battle, the ship managed to knock out 2 of HMS Tiger's turrets for an extended period before it was engaged by the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships and sustained a heavily damaging hit from a 15-inch shell. She would go on to receive 3 further hits from such shells in the battle and emerged with extensive upper deck damage, which was mostly superficial, as well as over 1,000 tons of water flooding through holes in the ship caused by the shells. She was, however, in relatively good condition compared to the other German battlecruisers, and could actually move at speed and still fight, something none of the others were capable of doing. She later took part in various raids on the British coast and on convoys trying to lure out a portion of the British fleet, in most cases having to return when the whole fleet came out after them. Ironically, the one time it looked like they might actually be able to catch an isolated squadron and destroy it, one of Moltke's propellers fell off and the engine room flooded, requiring them to return to port. The ship was then part of the German fleet that was interned at Scapa Flow and scuttled itself in 1919, with the ship raised and scrapped later in the 1920s.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.